watching TRT World's continuing coverage of the earthquakes that have hit southern Türkiye. I'm Imran Garda. Thousands of survivors of last week's earthquakes are receiving treatment in many hospitals around the country, including in Istanbul. But despite being in safe hands far from the disaster zone, many of the patients have mixed emotions as they reflect and recover. Esra Dürüst went to find out their stories.
Hospitals across Istanbul are working non-stop to treat the survivors of last week's earthquakes. Başakşehir Çamansakura City Hospital is one of them, and the patients here are still in a state of shock. Like most of his neighbors, Hacı Bayram Köroğlu was asleep when the first quake struck Malatya in the early hours of Monday morning, shortly before more than 1,000 buildings collapsed.
I'm 38 years old, but it felt like another 38 years passed in those 4 hours.
He says he tried to shield his 8-year-old son Ömer Efe, but the moment they opened their eyes, they were already under the rubble of their 6th-floor apartment.
My son's leg was broken. The wardrobe door fell off. My lower back was stuck under the closet, and a wall had trapped my legs. We were under the rubble for about 3.5–4 hours. My friends, my wife and relatives pulled us out. Maybe it's destiny, I don't know. Our quick exit at that moment, at that hour. I think we must have more breaths to take and meals to eat, thank God.
The Calam family were also on the 5th floor of a 6-story building in Hatay. But their rescue operation took 4 days and only one of them made it out alive. Now, Hülya Kılın is in intensive care, unsure whether one of her sons is still alive. Her other son and husband both died. Kılın's siblings and relatives are hoping to reunite with her again after waiting for more than 94 hours beside the rubble.
I experienced desperation for the first time and the importance of racing against minutes and even seconds. I felt so helpless that I had crying fits. We tried to calm the children under the wreckage until the morning. We assured them that we would come.
And on the second day, he was helped by miners from the western town of Soma as they tried their best to clear the debris.
It comes into my dreams at night. Now when I close my eyes, I see what we went through. I don't know how we will get over this trauma. May God help our country.
So far, 950 patients have been brought to Başakşehir Çamansakura City Hospital, with some of them already discharged. Dr. Emrah Kovalak says the orthopedics department currently has 125 patients, although this number can change every hour.
Our patients are generally in stable condition. They've mostly sustained crush injuries. They have fractures. Patients in intensive care are also getting better by the day.
Dr. Özlem Altuntaş Aydın says crush injuries can also lead to infection and that access to clean water and sanitation right now is vital to prevent the spread of diseases.
After such disasters, we often see more infections in earthquake victims due to these kind of crash injuries. And after the 4th and 5th day, infections can increase due to a lack of access to clean water and food. Later, we may see the spread of COVID-19, influenza, pneumonia, and other upper respiratory tract infections, as well as meningitis, which are transmitted through droplets, especially if people are crowded into small areas.
Murat Esici had sustained a broken leg in Gaziantep after his door became stuck during the quake and left him with no other option than to jump out of the 2nd floor.
I am calm right now, but when I return to those moments, they appear in front of my eyes over and over again. Even when the bed just so happens to shake, I worry it's another earthquake.
Survivors here are still having trouble coming to terms with what they've just endured. And while their injuries may soon heal, they will need a lot more time to even begin to shake off the trauma, or to be convinced that the worst may now be behind them. Esra Dürüst, TRT World.
Well, joining me now from Amman is Racha Nasreddine. She's the director for ActionAid in the Arab region, and it's really good to talk to you. Racha, where do you even begin when it comes to responding to a disaster of this scale, especially when so many people are suffering on so many different levels?
Thank you for having me today. Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very large-scale disaster. Especially, I mean, we are responding mainly in northwest Syria, and the area there, for example, had already been suffering for 12 years. So usually we first, when we look at our response, first thing we do is provide life-saving assistance. After this disaster, as you know, a lot of people have lost their homes. So the first thing you would think about is shelter, food. We have bad weather conditions. It's literally freezing outside. So we provide heating, and then you would think about like the mental health and the well-being of the people, and because they are, of course, traumatized, like women, children, large families. So we think of, again, mental health and psychosocial support. So these are like immediately the first things you think about. But then, of course, currently, due to the scale of this disaster, we cannot think beyond the immediate. And I think later on, we would all need to think about like the medium term and the longer term about the recovery. But now it's too early because the size of the needs on the ground is huge.
How many people do you have on the ground?
So currently we have, like with me in Amman, I have around like 20 people from the humanitarian team working with me, but on the ground we have local partners who we work through, and there are around like 2,000 people currently on the ground responding to this crisis from our local partners. We are as well also trying to deploy people into like to support our partners, but again, due to the scale of this disaster, this is taking also more time than expected.
A lot of people want to help, they want to donate, they want to contribute. What do you need in order to do your job better, particularly when it comes to those who are very vulnerable, the women and children who have survived the catastrophe but need as much help as possible?
I mean, I think the immediate thing we need is basically funding. And for the size of this disaster, we need large-scale funding to be able to meet all the needs. As ActionAid around the world, we've launched different appeals. The public has been really very, very generous, like from different countries like Australia, Denmark, the UK, and other countries. Apologies if I'm missing anyone, but the public has been very generous, and because of this money, we were able to contribute to the needs of the people. I think funding is the first thing we need. Solidarity with the people and that are going into this crisis is another thing. And again, we've had a lot of solidarity from across the world. I think the third thing is how to amplify the voices of these people that are on the ground and like putting it out there on the media and keeping the stories going up so that there is more visibility and again also more support for such crises.
And just very finally, how much more does it complicate your efforts, given the fact that, as you mentioned at the very beginning, northwest Syria is still a conflict zone?
I mean, yeah, exactly. So because that area was already struggling and had a huge need, so this disaster came in to just exacerbate the suffering of the people there and to add to their needs. So currently, around 90% of the population in northwest Syria is in need of support. The previous response before this disaster was not fully funded, and now we see ourselves as needing more funds to be able to support and provide for the immediate needs. So it's just complicates it a lot, but we are trying our best to keep on at least providing the life-saving assistance, but while keeping in mind also what would people need at the longer term, which is again a big question, and it requires big efforts and large-scale funding to be able to meet the needs that could come at the medium and longer term.
Racha Nasreddine, I wish you all the best with your work. I thank you very much for joining us. Thousands of children are feared dead in the aftermath of last week's twin earthquakes. The children who have survived have been enduring desperate humanitarian conditions, in some cases alone, after being orphaned or separated from their families. Child services in Istanbul have been receiving some of those affected youth and are racing to reunite them with living relatives.
Merhabalar, ben Merve Baş. İstanbul.
My name is Merve Baş. I'm the Director of Child Services at Istanbul's Family and Social Services Directorate. Currently, all of our efforts are being directed towards protecting youth affected by the earthquakes. 142 children in need of protection and care have been brought to Istanbul from the earthquake zone, and they are being looked after in our child care facilities. We are working together with Istanbul's Health Directorate to provide psychological treatments for children who are experiencing the effects of trauma. Hospitals in the city have also been receiving youth who are in need of medical treatments. Once treatment is complete, there is an assessment of whether or not the child is separated from their family. If they are placed in our care and we begin the process of locating and contacting relatives. To help with identification, we use a facial recognition software called Derin Guru, which was developed by TÜBİTAK in collaboration with the Istanbul Health and Security Directorates. Children whose identity is verified are then assessed before being reunited with their families.
And it's worth noting that using that facial recognition technology that Merve spoke about there, at least 78 children have been reunited with their families. That's really heartwarming, and hopefully many more to come. Well, let's broaden this out now. Joining me now from Berlin is the CEO of Save the Children, Inga Ashing. Inga, good to talk to you here on the program. Children need to be saved. They need to be reunited with their families, hopefully fed, housed, healed. There's so much to do. It's a week on since the disaster. Tell me how it's going. Tell me the scale of the trouble and the tragedy and what's being done.
Thank you so much. I mean, we know that it's now estimated that we have around over 42,000 deaths and with about 33 million people impacted in total, including at least 7 million children. So we are talking about a huge group of people whose lives have been thrown upside down overnight, and thousands of lives have been claimed. I think we really need to understand that the children are not just suffering from the earthquake as such, but we are now in a race against time to protect children and their families from a secondary humanitarian disaster. Because of the fact that many of them have lost everything they own, they don't have any place to live, they don't have anything at all anymore. There's a risk of rising hunger, there's a risk of diseases, outbreaks, and there's a total collapse of public services due to the earthquake. We meet children and families in desperate need of food, water, shelter, warm clothing, with thousands now sleeping outside in freezing winter conditions. And we are hearing reports from Hatay that there are no drinking water or toilets, multiplying the risks of disease and illness as families are forced to relieve themselves outside and turn to contaminated water sources. So it's absolutely critical that we are able to provide children and their family with basic needs, but also that we are starting to look after their long-term needs, because the emotional stress that these children have been, that they have experienced is something that will take a lot of time to mend and heal.
Yeah, Inga, your organization does amazing work around the world in many conflict zones. It's not only natural disasters, it's places where there's war, it's places where there's drought and famine. How would you compare this disaster after the twin earthquakes to the work that you've been doing in other regions that are suffering?
So, of course, there are a lot of similarities when there's a humanitarian crisis. First, you need to attend to people's basic needs: food, shelter, water, basic protection. And then you need to attend to some of the longer term challenges. I think what is particularly critical in this situation is that the whole system, I mean, infrastructure, public services, all of that has been disrupted. So we also have a major risk of secondary crisis, as I said, and the challenge to at times access the people in need is really a risk to the communities that we want to serve, and is something that we and other responding organizations are trying to address.
Okay, well, stay where you are, Inga. Let's bring in Ebru Salcioglu now, who's a clinical psychologist at the Center for Behavioral Studies and Therapies in Istanbul, and Rachel Calam from Manchester, who's a professor of child and family psychology. Really nice to have you all on the program. Ebru, let me begin with you here. As we look at the scale of the disaster, it's not just physical, it's mental, it's emotional, trauma, and suffering comes in many, many forms. Your advice to those who are trying to help would be what?
Well, this is such a huge crisis because the earthquake had devastating effects on the population living there. But at the same time, as Inger mentioned, there is a humanitarian crisis that is unfolding right now. So this is just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do in the coming days, months, and even years, because we know that psychological effects of earthquakes linger in the long term. After the 1999 earthquakes, we conducted studies in the earthquake region, and with over 1,000 to 2,300 people, we found that those effects do not resolve with time. In 1 to 4 years after trauma, the rates of traumatic stress reactions remain the same, and 40% of the population had these reactions. So we are going to deal with so many chronic problems in the coming years, and we definitely need effective interventions to deal with this impact of the disaster on both children and adults at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned both children and adults at the same time, because Rachel, it reminds me of the fact that when you are in an airplane, they tell you, well, in case of emergency, you put on the oxygen mask for yourself first, you buckle up first, then you help somebody else. And do we have to be cognizant of that fact that if you cannot be healthy, if you cannot be of sound mind and taking care of yourself, then there's very little chance that the children are going to be helped as well.
One of the things that we really advise is that parents look after themselves as part of looking after the children that they're looking after, that caregivers and parents look after themselves. And we've produced brief advice that helps parents and caregivers take care of themselves and take care of the children that they're responsible for, because they're so interlinked. And the mental health and physical health of both are absolutely interlinked.
Right. Ebru, whose responsibility is this? I mean, it's a question that's difficult to answer when I think about it, because do you intervene and try and force it? I mean, if I think about people who are suffering on the ground, they've lost their homes, they've lost family members, one would think that sometimes the last thing they'd want is somebody to show up and say, how are you feeling? I'm here to make you feel better. How do you navigate this and finesse it in a way that allows people to heal at their own pace in their own time?
Well, I think many people rush into the earthquake region with good intentions. They want to help, and I understand this. But they need to be very careful, actually, because we know that after the traumatic events, over 90% of the survivors are affected psychologically. They develop acute traumatic stress responses, but these responses resolve in time by themselves. So there are natural recovery processes that are responsible for people's healing in time. So the interventions that are offered to survivors should not stop or interfere with these processes. So I think, that road to hell is paved with good intentions. People need to be careful. They need to be well trained. They should know what to do and when to do it and how to do it. So rather than doing this unsystematically and offering them, some kind of a psychological support without any evidence base, we should wait and we should plan and develop a program to reach out to people there when they are ready to receive this kind of help. Now they are dealing with their basic needs. They need shelter, they need food, they need some kind of stability in their lives. So we need to wait for these to happen. Of course, there will be people who will need help right now, and they will reach out to aid organizations or people offering such help.
Rachel, can you actually tackle the collective trauma and the individual trauma at the same time?
Well, I think what the previous speaker was saying was really important, because we can't just be jumping in and trying to offer lots of help. What we can do at this stage, or at least as soon as people have a roof over their heads and something to eat, is to provide some really basic information that can help to answer questions that they may have really immediately about caring for their children. Because for many people, this will be their first experience of a major trauma. They'll be seeing changes in their children and really not understanding that these are extremely common reactions. And as everyone was saying, these are reactions that will calm in time for a lot of children. So it's not a matter of jumping in and providing interventions straight away. That happens further down the line. But for now, there's all sorts of really helpful things that caregivers can be alerted to regarding how common these sorts of reactions are, what to expect, and also really important aspects of keeping children safe. So making sure that they're, reducing the risk of a whole multitude of secondary harms that could come about in these kinds of circumstances.
And as I circle this back to Inga Ashing, Inga, as the CEO of Save the Children, no doubt there has been a lot of progress among a lot of charities, aid organizations in the past couple of decades, where mental health, responding to trauma, these are taken far more seriously. You would probably, I would guess, have a lot of clinical psychologists working for Save the Children as well. Tell me the importance of that aspect in addition to feeding, housing, keeping safe.
So I agree with Ebru and Rachel that of course in an emergency, in a crisis, we need to attend to the basic needs first. But my experience and our experience is that it is important to make sure that we provide a space for children and their families to actually get access to some of the psychosocial support as well. What we often offer as an organization is what we call child-friendly spaces, and that is a space where you as a child can come, you can play, you can engage with facilitators in that safe space, and they are trained to also be able to provide basic psychosocial support, and because there's a lot of trauma, and as I also think, as Ebru, I think it was Ebru who said that. I mean, this is not something that we will need to respond in months and years to come, because this will be a massive trauma for the whole region that has been affected, and ensuring that we have, when we have provided for the basics needs, that we actually have a long-term commitment to the people that are affected, and from my perspective, really ensuring that children have child protection services provided to them, because there's a huge risk that they are being victims of other crises right now, and attending to their mental health, because as you say, Save the Children and all our other humanitarian responders, the mental health component in our responses is absolutely key in everything we do.
Ebru, how can we as the media do better? Because sometimes we're not mindful about our contribution to this. Go ahead, criticize us.
God, this is, well, of course, the portrayal of the images from the earthquake region is traumatizing for so many people, because they are anxiety-provoking, fear-evoking images for so many people who experienced the earthquake in the region, and who live in the regions that are going to be affected by another earthquake. For example, Istanbul is at risk of another earthquake, and these images are extremely frightening for people who watch. So maybe this kind of fear may mobilize them to take some cautions. Maybe they can be useful in earthquake preparedness efforts. So if it is utilized in a good way, yes, they can be helpful. But too much fear usually is debilitating. When
Right.
people are too afraid, they do not take action. So I think the media should be more responsible when it comes to show images from the earthquake region, and the emotional tone of the of how to portray them is also important. I think they need to be more, objective rather than, dramatizing.
Right.
Because we see this, that we see images with emotional music behind and descriptions with dramatic words. This is not objective reporting, and it is actually frightening so many people.
Yeah, these are interesting points that you make, and it's something that we wrestle with a lot of the time. And unfortunately, we are out of time. It's something that I'd love to discuss further. But Rachel, Ebru, and Inga, it is a pleasure having you all on the program. My sincere thank you for joining us on this special program here. Well, that's the news for now. We'll leave you with some pictures from the latest rescue operations in the quake-hit areas.